It is a full Unix implementation in that it does support virtual memory. It's not one of the small Unixes like Coherent or Minix or something like that. It tries to support everything. There are Unixes around that do more than Linux, but there are Unixes around that do less. So it has virtual memory, memory mapping, full TCP/IP networking, even though there have been rumors that it's not very stable. It is most of the time. It has System 5 inter-process communication and BSD sockets. And it has full Unix file systems. And it's not the System 514 character limit file system, but it has 255 characters file systems, and the 14 character file system, and the DOS file system, and so on. Oh, sorry. I didn't even mention it's free. I mean, I take it for granted that it's free, and it's very open. If I were a marketing department, I'd call it Open Linux. But as I'm not... As I'm not, I just call it Linux and tell you it's open and free, and it's written from scratch, so you don't have to pay AT&T anything at all. Okay, that's about it. It's available by FTP, so if you want to know where, I can put it down later or something like that. Okay. This is a small slide, and I ran out of room, so I'll just try to tell you anyway. The main thing about Linux is the good hardware support. It actually runs on more hardware than any other PC Unix. That's at least my guess. SCO might be close, or it might be slightly better, but Linux has drivers for almost anything out there, except the new stuff DEC puts in its PCs, so we had terrible problems getting Linux running on the DEC PC or in the whatever. Yeah. It also has support for lack of hardware, so if you don't have hardware like a coprocessor, it will emulate it. If you want to use something like DOS, which I suppose you don't, but if you want to use it, you can use it together with Linux, either under the Linux DOS emulator or side by side by rebooting into DOS. Some other systems actually take over the whole disk. I think BSD, the early versions certainly did. I don't know about the newer ones. It's also very useful for personal use due to the low cost of the actual operating system, which is free, and the low cost of the hardware it runs on. You can get an unbeatable price performance system. It's also pretty expandable due to the fact that you can, if you're really hurting, you can write your own drivers and whatever. You also, with a full Linux system, like on the CD-ROM, you get a complete system with X11 compilers like GCC, translators like P2C, Smalltalk, and so on, anything, plus 10 or 20 editors and so on, anything you want. For the professional user, it's mostly useful for software development. If you do work in a Sun OS system or similar and do Unix programming, you can have a home machine running Linux cheaply. Academic use, due to the fact that you have sources available for no additional cost, and you can implement your own features, you can test out your theories. I know Linux has been used in academia to test out things like new file systems, test out theory behind large address space machines. They simulated a 64-bit machine using Linux, and I know somebody submitted a paper on it to Summer U SNCS last year. I don't know if it was actually accepted. But the largest reason for running Linux is technical superiority. It's simply better than anything out there in the world. It's faster, it's smaller, it's meaner, it slices, dices, and so on. It runs endless loops in under 6 seconds or whatever. Works on everything and works very well. I know people have started using Linux because it's free and so on. So it's a cheap alternative. I also know people who have actually switched from a real Unix to Linux because it's faster and more stable. So, on the other hand, you may not want to use Linux. There's a noticeable lack of support. There are Linux companies out there. I know there are in the US. There's even one in Finland. But obviously you can't call a 1-800 number and just ask for support. On the other hand, you do have support in electronic form if you are connected to the network. There are 5 Linux news groups who are there to support you. And there are mailing lists too. But that may not be quite what you want. Also, the documentation of Linux is kind of sparse. It's mostly in electronic form. I know of 3 books in German. Sadly enough, I don't speak any German. I know 1 book in English, which is available both electronically and in paperback. But you are not going to get kind of 5 meters of documentation when you get Linux. Which may be a good point, after all. Also, it doesn't run many commercial programs. If you want to run, Windows Write or something like that, it doesn't run on Linux yet. MATLAB has been a problem in some circles. There are alternatives, but they generally have problems, things like that. Also, one problem with Linux is actual trusting the system. Because it's free, people tend to think, okay, you get what you pay for, which is kind of irritating. For me, personally, also, while it's technically superior, it does have some technical problems. While I said it runs on almost everything, I meant it runs on almost any PC. It does not run on the alphas yet. It also does not run on Spark stations, so you are stuck with Solaris in that case. I'm actually hoping to have an alpha board at home for testing for half a year, so we'll see what comes. What? Excuse me? There is a 68K port going on for the older Macs, but it's actually for the Atari and Amiga computers. And I doubt it will ever get ported to the Mac because the documentation on a hardware level is kind of scanty, sort of. The PowerPC, maybe. Also, the code is kind of young. The whole kernel is less than 3 years old. So parts like networking still do have some stability problems. There are small limitations, like the memory mapping actually only supports read-only mappings on files right now. So you can't map in a file into memory, write to memory, and the file changes. You can only map and read only. Whoops. Okay. I hope everybody knows what Linux is. So we'll take up why it's been written. The obvious answer is DOS. PC hardware is getting lots better, but the operating systems certainly have not been getting better as fast as the hardware. So when I bought the computer, I didn't want to run DOS. Instead, I bought a small Unix system called Minix, written by Andy Tannenbaum of Amsterdam, and ran that, but the limitations of that system just resulted in me actually starting writing my own. The reason I couldn't use real Unix was because real Unix costs lots of money. It's become cheaper now, I hope partially because of Linux, but back 3 years ago, a real Unix full license cost something like 20,000 Finnish marks, which is, what, $5,000, $4,000. So for a student with no money at all, it's not really an option. Of course, those are just the kind of motivations you want to say. The real motivation, of course, was just to have fun and write something interesting. It also turned out to be highly educational, and you get, if you write your own operating system, you get to travel all around the world and see interesting and weird people like yourself. Okay. Actually, what you need to write your own Unix is, A, you have to be stark raving mad. But that's not a problem, at least from the limited experience I've had with the Unisig people. So I have four main points. You have to be totally ignorant. If you know what you're doing, you obviously also know that this is not worth it. I mean, if you know the semantics of select, how many people know select? Okay, well, you're out already. You don't want to implement select under Unix, so on. Also, you have to be an arrogant bastard, because assuming, hypothetical question, assuming you were writing your own operating system under a system called Minix, which has been written by a very well-known professor inside of the operating system community, assuming you were writing it and this professor publicly announced that your system was worth nothing and was obsolete before it was even written, what's your reaction? A, you think he's probably right and you forget about it. B, you think, okay, I'll try anyway. Or C, ha, what does he know anyway? Okay. If you answered C, then okay, you might be in the running yet. Actually, this was not a hypothetical question, as you might have guessed, but was actually what happened. So, okay, once you've got the system up and running and doing something, you have to actually have the stamina to continue with it, because there's going to be problems and you're going to hit your head against the wall several times, so you'd better just keep on going. And then every once in a while you have to have some inspiration. I can solve this problem this way. That's actually the smallest part, I think. Okay. Over to some dates. I bought my PC in early 1991. That was after having gone through a Unix class at the university. So I had seen my first Unix half a year before that. And decided at once that I wanted to use Unix at home too. So I bought the Minix system, and what I didn't start out to do was write an operating system. Instead, Minix lacked a terminal emulator, so I wrote my own. And I actually wanted to test out my new machine at the same time, so I decided, okay, let's see. This machine has multitasking capabilities in hardware, so let's do it by doing 2 tasks in the terminal emulator, quite like Kermit does. But we do it in hardware all the way. So I did a very simple program. Well, actually, it's not very simple because the 386 protected mode hardware is very hard to actually program. That was a terminal emulator. That's where it all began. And then I kind of added features, and soon it was the GNU Emacs of terminal emulators, and I called it Linux. This was in August 91, I actually had a system that did something useful. So I made it public in September to get some feedback. And to be quite frank, at that point it wasn't worth very much. It booted, it ran a shell, it ran GCC, which was my kind of first milestone. But if you tried to compile a big program, it crashed because the buffer handling didn't work out very well. So I kind of worked on that, and by November 91, it really worked very well. And people who had used Minix before were starting to switch over because Linux did things faster, worked better on fast machines, and so on. By that time, I got the problem that I had 8 megs of memory, which was ample by my standards back then, and could compile the kernel with no problems at all. But people who had smaller machines, like just 2 megs, also wanted to start playing with this. And they couldn't compile the kernel because they didn't have enough space for GCC. So just to get one of those people off my back, I sat down and wrote the virtual memory in 3 days before Christmas, 91. It actually worked, but had so many bugs that the last ones were found kind of half a year later. Last ones. Okay. Then in May of 92, we actually got X11 release 5 working. At that time, it was really a port of the official X Consortium X11 code. A month later, Linux got into the X386 project, and that's what we're using now, which is kind of, it's X11 R5, but it's got lots of enhancements for the PC. And then I skipped lots of things. Networking got started with X. Drivers got written and so on. And this March, I released version 1.0. all in all, it took pretty exactly 3 years from beginning of coding to 1.0, which is not too bad. Okay. I don't know what your reaction is, but I know I get the question pretty often, why make it free? You could be the Bill Gates of Finland by now if you hadn't. Actually, I start off by answering no, I wouldn't, because if I hadn't made it free, it would never have developed as it has. I'd probably have thought it an interesting project and continued for half a year on it, and then I'd say, okay, this is nice, and then I'd left. Making it free and available for lots of people adds a lot to your motivation. You get the feedback that motivates you to continue developing the system. I got lots of mails for the first few releases, which were not really usable, but they kind of still kept me going. And the feedback also results in bug reports. So you fix the bugs faster because you actually notice them. It also results in lots of new ideas. When I started out writing Linux, I didn't know what a PTY was. And as I mentioned, I didn't know what select was. I was totally clueless about Unix, and I got lots of good ideas from making it public and letting people say, hey, why doesn't this one support select? I'd like to use select. I said, what? Okay, so also testing, especially on PC hardware, testing is a real problem because PC hardware is junk. The processor is good. Actually, I like the 386. It has too few registers, but it's a solid piece of hardware otherwise. But the surrounding hardware is very varied and doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. So when you do a PC port of Unix, you're in for lots of surprises. And I think Sun noticed this with the 386 Solaris, which I think is dead. Maybe not officially, but it didn't seem to work on as many machines as they had hoped for. Also, not just testing, but people actually wrote drivers. So peripherals I couldn't even test because I didn't have them. Other people wrote drivers for, and now Linux has drivers for something like 10 different SCSI controllers, of which I have just one, and I didn't even need to write the driver for that one. So I say I'm the father of Linux, but actually I've written probably less than half the code in the kernel. The disadvantages of making it free, I'll start off by saying these are the disadvantages people expect. They aren't real. Negative comments, you're maybe a bit afraid of what people will say about your coding style. Hey, this works, but actually I have gotten very few negative comments at all. Most of them were from the aforementioned Andrew Tannenbaum. Also, making it free under GPL, people start wondering, don't you feel bad about it if people take advantage of your work and sell it for lots of money? Actually, nobody has sold it for lots of money, but the CD-ROMs that are going to be raffled out, they are being sold for money, and no, I'm not getting anything for it. I don't mind. Frankly, I enjoy the publicity and getting flight over the world, and so on. And okay, no economic gain is already there. I expect to get some economic gain from it because I'm pretty sure I'll get a job working at some company someday. Okay. Okay, we're a bit early maybe. By now, the user base, which I have no idea about how large it is, but it's large. Linux is probably the largest PC Unix in the world right now. I have no firm numbers, but I expect 100,000 machines running Linux to be a lower bound. The only numbers I have is that the Yggdrasil CD-ROM was sold in 10,000 copies for the first release, and people who get it by FTP are probably more usual. So Linux is actually pretty popular. There are lots of different distributions. The ones being raffled out are what? Trans-Ameritech?
Yes.
Okay. There's the Yggdrasil I already mentioned. There's a couple of CD-ROM distributions that are essentially just copies of the FTP sites, Yana and some other. I think I personally have 5 CD-ROMs, different CD-ROMs, and I don't do anything with them because I don't have a drive. There's also kind of disk copying services going on, one in Canada, probably a few in the US, and there are lots of different distributions just being made available by FTP. I don't actually do these distributions. I just do the kernel sources and let other people then compile it and make a complete system of it. So I try to not have to do with those things. Also, Linux is finally getting some media recognition. PC Week had it as the product of the week here a month ago, perhaps. So we hope that the user base will actually grow. Okay. Then off for some comments about the future. With the 1.0 release, I got a few questions about A, will it continue to be free? And B, will I continue to develop it? And the answer to both is yes. In fact, there is already a 1.1 source tree, which is available at the PC in the hall across the building. The new releases adds memory management and networking capabilities. And I'll obviously be continuing work on Linux for at least the next few years if interest keeps up. Also, we'll add or work on adding source compatibility. None of the standards are actually ratified right now because it seems it costs a lot. But there has been some talk about actually ratifying Linux as POSIX.1 and possibly some other standards. I have the XPG3 manuals. I've opened them once, and they were boring, and I closed them again. But maybe somebody else will do the work for that, so we can always hope. Also, while I'm not very excited about the idea, Linux is moving into the direction of binary compatibility. with DOS through the DOS emulator, which actually works pretty well right now. It's still considered to be alpha software, but it's available and runs most normal DOS programs. It doesn't run games very well, but you can use it for WordPerfect and so on. It even works under an Xterm, albeit a bit slower and not as completely. We are also working on, and indeed it works already again, supporting the standard Intel binary compatibility specification version 2, aka IBC S2. This is done through loadable modules, which change the personality of the system so that the system calls operate the way the standard binaries expect them to. This is not part of the standard kernel right now, but people report that with the patches, it actually runs SEO binaries of WordPerfect under X. So that way we'll get some commercial support for people who need the commercial programs. Also, the perhaps most exciting product would be Windows emulation. There's work going on with a project called Wine, which should be a free Windows emulator for the X. It's not even close to ready yet. It runs the most important program, which is the solitaire game, but that's about it. There's been rumors of the Sun Wabi product, whatever they call it. There's also been rumors about a third product for Novell, which I may come into a bit. The idea is that with Windows emulation, you could actually run a large number of good programs, which sadly now run only under a large number of bad operating systems. So, and some future too. I already mentioned the 68K port, which is at Linux 1.0 standard, but is not complete at this point and doesn't run on very many machines. It runs on some Amigas. There is a booting Atari port, but it's a step in the right direction. Also, there has been a lot of discussions about porting Linux to some of the more interesting newer RISC processors like the DEC Alpha and the PowerPC. I have a contact at DEC Netherlands who is going to contact DEC Finland, who is possibly going to get me a DEC Alpha machine. We don't know. Also, work on documentation and support is still going on. So there are the books I already mentioned. There are more on the way, the kind of installation and system administration guides needed to get a new user going. Also, companies like Novell, which, as you may know, owns the Unix source licenses, there was a small article in PC Week, again, April 25th, that said Novell is actually going to release, or possibly going to release, CD-ROM containing not Unixware but Linux, along with a Windows emulator, Looking Glass, X-Windows interface, and so on. This may or may not be reality, but it at least shows that people and companies are looking into Linux as a viable alternative to commercial software. I'm afraid that's about it. I'll do the step dance after the second session.
See, you survived the first one. There wasn't any real problem, was there?
No real problem.
I'd like to remind you of two things. If you haven't already done so, want to drop your card or your badge in the bag up here for the drawing. We're going to be raffling off 2 autographed copies of the Transameritek Linux CD-ROMs. And also, I'd like to thank John Hall and Digital Equipment Corporation for making these talks possible. Stand up, John.
Much more Digital Equipment Corporation than it was me, okay?
But it took your fine Irish temper. So if there are any questions, please line up behind the mic. Fire away.
One question, do you know if any of the major database companies like Oracle or Sybase or any of those folks are planning on porting their products to Linux?
The question was, do you know any major database companies planning to port to Linux? And the answer is no. I have no idea, and I'm not a database person myself, so I wouldn't have even looked into it. Sorry.
Could you write down the FTP sites that have the 1.0?
Okay. Yeah. Does anybody have a pen to actually write them down?
Here.
Okay. Oops. Okay. I'll use this one. I assume most of you aren't Finnish, and one of you is, but in the US, the main sites are tsx11 at .mit.edu and sunsite UNC edu. This one is in pub Linux. This one is also, but with capital L. Okay. There are lots of others, but these are the two major ones in the US. Actually, I might add that if you do get a Linux distribution, the best one at this point seems to be the one called Slackware, which should be in images Slackware on Sunsite. I don't remember the exact location on TSX11. That one contains enough documentation to get you started and lots of things. It's a complete Unix system. Takes up 130 megs of your hard disk if you want to install it all. Okay, any other questions?
Anthony Collins, International Potato Center in Lima. Following on from the previous question, I was going to ask if anyone knew whether Oracle version 6 would run under Linux.
What? Could you repeat?
I guess the question was whether Oracle version 6 would run under Linux.
I don't know anything about Oracle version 6. I know they only, there are a few databases running under Linux, and they are just the GNU one, which is called Metal Base or something like that, I think, and older versions of Ingress, I think.
Yes, I can add the observation that Oracle version 5 is available and runs under Xenix.
Well, it might actually run under Linux with the IBCS2 patches. I haven't tried. I actually have no System 5 software at all, so I haven't tried the IBCS2 patches at all. I started off from scratch, so I don't have any installed base of software I could try on. Sorry.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, if not, let's draw some names. You get to do that.
I get to do that. Okay.
There's even airline tickets in there. From the bottom of the bucket, we draw...
David E. Ellis, Vice President, Chief Scientist, Rocket Scientist, and Director of Albuquerque Operations. Thanks.
Okay. I've never met him before in my life. And the second person is...
Timothy Cook, computer specialist from, I'm not going to pronounce this one. Okay.
I see two people moving. I assume it's the one that isn't.
No, Comtet.
Right.
Congratulations. I just won a free copy of Linux. Damn. Okay. Okay. Uh-oh.
Yeah, he did say he was going to be tap dancing and doing traditional Finnish folk dances in between the sessions. Where's Christy? She was going to accompany him.
Could we take this after the second talk? What? Distribution slackware. Okay. I'm told it's okay. Instead of images. Images and distributions. Okay. What? I'm actually not certain. I'd have thought it was images slackware, but it might be images distribution slackware, or it might be just distribution slackware. And you'll find it if you have a working directory listing routine, hopefully. Yes? There are no public domain ports of Motif, but there is a commercial version of Motif which sells for $89 for the limited version and $100 and something for the development version. Actually, they are selling a Motif package which it's labeled Motif, I understand, but it actually contains a complete Linux distribution. So you can just buy a CD-ROM and get Motif and Linux. Motif isn't available for free anywhere.
There is now currently a Linux journal as well, and in fact there might be two people from the Linux journal here. If you're here, you want to identify yourself by looking at each other and saying, "Hi, I work with you."
Okay.
I know they were going to come. I'm not sure if they're here or not. There they are. There's all two of them. You'll find a lot of the vendors are advertising in the journal, and it's actually a pretty good source of information, as well as the news groups, and as well as cornering Linus and talking to him. So anyway, next session will...
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the window manager included in the X11 distribution?
The window manager. There are actually several ones. The best one, in my opinion, is a feeble window manager, which was written for Linux originally, but now ported to several other architectures, which is kind of based on TVM's sources and then added lots of features, nifty features. It's almost completely customizable. There's OpenLook if you want that. Motif you already mentioned. TVM, CTVM, they're all available if you want. I'd actually appreciate a few more questions. I don't like my step dancing acts. Okay. We can just go on and stop early, maybe.
You're not getting out of the tap dancing that easy. Why don't you have a seat and relax and take a deep breath and have a beer.
A question. Where?
Frank Ennis, Hahnemann University, Philadelphia. And this is just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
What are people actually doing with it? What's the most ambitious application of Linux that you know of?
Ambitious, most ambitious.
Like challenging and...
Well, the most challenging is writing operating systems. I know Linux is used for Linux on PC is used for as cheap X terminals at one hospital. I don't know at which, so you can't avoid it if you are there. I also know there's a Linux PC on Antarctica doing some kind of mail forwarding or similar. I know there's a Linux PC on one large supertanker which is used to as a fax forwarder with satellite link and so on. Ooh, hard to say. It's rumored AT&T has a Linux lab with Linux machines, but that's okay. Yeah. Hard. Yeah, probably. Well, I'm going for a Master of Sciences, but I've been going for that now for 5 years, and I expect it to take at least 2 more years. Okay?
Otto Scheinflug, Anderson Consulting. I'm really up here because I disdained Finnish folk dancing. So my just question was along those lines. How old are you? What's your background in computers? How long have you been doing this? How long do you sleep every night? Things like that.
Only one question at a time, and please go to the end of the line after asking each one.
What was the first one? I'm 24 actually, yeah? Hard to keep track. 24 years old, started when I was 11, on a VIC-20, if it's familiar to any of you. Then moved on to a Sinclair QL, which probably isn't familiar to any of you, which taught me never to buy a small machine that wasn't supported, so I bought a PC even though it had DOS. I do sleep 8 hours a night. I lied when I said I don't sleep any much. The fact that I use lots of time on Linux just means I use less on my studies and on my work. Did that cover everything? Okay. And I even have time for my girlfriend and cats occasionally. Okay. Well, I'm teaching assistant at the university, which means studying is actually part of my work. So I can say I'm working even when I'm working on Linux. I'm also sadly supposed to program something for Microsoft Windows, which I have no clue at all about, but we'll see. I gave the Swedish small introduction to computers course last fall. So I'm kind of a do-it-all kind of guy. What? It's, I don't know. I didn't write it, but it's definitely commercial. It has something like a $10,000 source license, and then you have to pay.
That's a decision by the MIT folk that wrote it. Whatever. OSF folks, sorry. I don't know anything. I'm just a SIG chair. Question?
Andrew Potter, Rochester Institute of Technology. I just thought I'd let you know some of the things that's happening with Linux at RIT. It's growing very rapidly, and its uses are just about anything that anyone uses a Unix system for on an academic campus. We've got people doing Mosaic development and setting up a World Wide Web server on it. A large number of students have come onto the campus network who are in computer science programs and use SUNS for their academic studies, have set up Linux on their PCs in their dorms and their network, or even using some of the network connectivity tools. that come with Slackware distribution. Some of the network tools that are very exciting is one called Term that a lot of users use. It's a poor man's let's get the next best thing to slip connectivity, where you actually log into a Unix machine over a dial-up line asynchronously, and it's, come to a shell prompt and start up this client program that essentially redirects IP sockets back to your own machine so that you can run IP applications on your own machine, or TCP applications on your own machine, and they are redirected as if they are coming from the machine that you're on, so that you can send X servers back, or you can send Mosaic, you can run Mosaic clients, and a number of other things on your machines. This is actually, a number of people are doing this at our site. People are using it for their mail engines, they're using it for, you name it. Whatever anyone uses a Unix system for in an academic environment, Linux is doing it, and in many cases better.
Good. Rick Tangden, Rocketdyne Division, Rockwell International. One of our system administrators has observed that he prefers the Linux interface to the HP UX interface. He says Linux is much more professional. My question is, what feature do you want to see next in Linux? What's on your wish list?
I'll come to some of the kernel features in my next talk. Actually, I'd really like to have a Windows emulator, because one of the things I miss under Linux is, now I said it myself, under Linux is that there is no good word processor. These slides, I'm ashamed to admit, were done under Windows. So I'd like to have a Windows emulator just to be able to do my slides under one true operating system.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, well, I guess if there's no more questions, unless you want to take a quick break.
Okay.
Do you want to take a quick break? And then
2 minutes.
2-minute break.
In case somebody is coming for the second talk.
Okay. 2 minutes break, and do you need an escort again, or do we have your word you'll come back?
I'll come back.
Okay.
Okay.
I got friends here though. If you imagine I have to win.
They'll probably walk off with it.
Yeah, they probably will. Well, I know where they live.
We're just going to draw another 2 at the end of this session.
I don't leave.
I'll give you the phone number off of this one.